The air in the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something else, something older, more stagnant. It clung to my nostrils like a damp shroud. I ran a gloved hand over the cold steel of the examination table, the faint hum of the ancient refrigeration unit a low thrum beneath the silence. This wasn't my usual workspace. My lab back in the city had climate control that actually worked, and equipment that didn't sound like it was on its last gasp. But here I was, hunched over a slab in this forgotten corner of the state, called in because the local authorities had, as the precinct captain put it, run out of bright ideas and fresh bodies. The case file lay open beside me, its pages brittle with age. It was a Jane Doe, discovered nearly 30 years ago, half buried in the woods bordering the old highway. Cause of death, undetermined. The original investigator's notes were sparse, a testament to the limited resources and even more limited enthusiasm for a case that had gone cold before I'd even finished my undergraduate studies. No ID, no witnesses, no lades, the scribbled conclusion read. Standard fare for a missing person that turned up decades later, but something about the photograph tucked into the file snagged my attention. A young woman, her face pale and indistinct in the grainy, black and white print. There was a faint scar, almost imperceptible, above her left eyebrow. It was the kind of detail easily overlooked, lost in the blur of time and poor reproduction. I leaned closer, my breath misting the plastic sleeve. My eyes, trained to see the stories etched into bone, found a familiar echo. Anything, user ib. The voice, a gravelly rumble, came from the doorway. The local detective stood there, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. He was a man built like a bull, with tired eyes that had seen too much and cared too little. I didn't look up immediately. My mind was already sifting through decades of case files stored in the labyrinth of my memory. The skeletal remains, I began, my voice low. They are remarkably well preserved, considering. A small mercy, I supposed. The soil conditions here were, thankfully, neutral. The detective grunted, stepping further into the room. He kicked a stray piece of debris near the door. That's what the county coroner said. Said it's like he was just put there. No signs of struggle, no obvious trauma. Skeletal trauma can be subtle. I countered, my fingers tracing the outline of the skull, now laid out on a separate tray. Especially after this much time, the elements can smooth over a lot of evidence. I pointed to the area above the left orbital ridge. See this? He squinted, his brow furrowed. What am I looking at? A scratch. It's a healed fracture, I corrected him. Old before death, and look at the curvature of the tibia. I indicated the long bone of the lower leg. Consistent with a significant impact. Not enough to break it, but enough to leave a mark. Something that would affect gait, perhaps. He crossed his arms, his gaze drifting from the bones to my face. So what are I saying? She fell? Possibly, I conceded. Or he was struck. Hard, the point is. It wasn't an insignificant injury, and it's not documented in the original report. I tapped the photograph, and this scar, it's faint, but it's there. A healed laceration likely from childhood or adolescence. He let out a sigh, the sound heavy with impatience. Most of them end up like this, unsolved. We're lucky we even found her. I finally met his gaze, my own steady. I understand that. But there are details here, even in this minimal record, that suggest a story beyond a simple accident or a random act of violence. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. This woman, the Jane Doe from 30 years ago, he had a history of trauma before she died. He shifted his weight, his skepticism palpable. And what does that mean for us now? We don't even know who he is. That's the first question, isn't it? I murmured, my gaze returning to the skull. Who was she? And what else happened to her? The hum of the refrigeration unit seemed to deepen, a low, unsettling drone. This wasn't just one forgotten victim. The air in the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, hung thick and still, carrying the faint, metallic tang of disinfectant struggling to mask something far more primal. I'd been staring at the skull for what felt like hours, the single, pale light fixture overhead casting long, dancing shadows that did little to soothe my frayed nerves. The previous night's storm had knocked out the main power, leaving me to rely on the aging generator and a handful of battery-powered lamps. Not exactly ideal for delicate work, but I didn't have the luxury of waiting. The skull, that of the young woman found near the old logging road, was my current obsession. Her features were delicate, almost bird-like, despite the trauma. The blows that had ended her life were brutal, but there was a tidiness to the way the damage was distributed, a chilling precision that always set my teeth on edge. It spoke of intent, of something beyond a crime of passion. I ran a gloved finger over a healed fracture on the frontal bone, a faint, jagged line beneath the smooth surface. This wasn't new. This had happened long before the fatal injuries. A fall, an accident, or something else. My gaze drifted to the file splayed open beside me, filled with grainy photographs and faded reports. The victim's name, or what we thought was her name, was listed as Jane Doe. Classic. Always starts with a Jane Doe. I picked up one of the larger bones, the femur, turning it over in my hands. The generator outside sputtered, a momentary dip in the lights that made me flinch. This place, this makeshift lab, felt so far removed from the sterile, high-tech facilities I was accustomed to. But it was all I had. The local sheriff, a grizzled man with eyes that had seen too much, had been surprisingly accommodating, if a little bewildered by my presence. It was a far cry from my usual setup, but the bones didn't care about the amenities. They just told their story. My attention snagged on a small, almost imperceptible discoloration on the femur near the proximal end. It wasn't the usual post-mortem staining. This was different, a subtle pitting, as if something had been applied, something that had eaten away at the surface. I leaned closer, the beam of my headlamp cutting a sharp circle of light. It was faint, so faint I almost dismissed it as an artifact of the bone's preservation. But the pattern, a knot began to tighten in my stomach. I'd seen this before, not exactly, but a similar anomaly. A young man, found miles from here, in a shallow grave near the abandoned quarry. His remains had been badly decomposed, but I'd noted a peculiar discoloration on one of his long bones. The initial report had dismissed it as natural decomposition, but something had always gnawed at me. I reached for the box of old files, my movements suddenly urgent. The sheriff had been kind enough to send me copies of my most significant past cases, just in case. He'd called it precautionary. Now, it felt like providence. My fingers fumbled through the thick manila folders, smell of old paper and dust filling my nostrils. I was looking for the quarry case, the one with the young man. What was his name? David Miller, that was it. My heart gave a strange, uncomfortable lurch. I found the file thicker than I remembered. The photographs were faded, the reports brittle, but the images were seared into my memory. I spread them out on the cold metal table, my hands trembling slightly, and there it was. A close-up shot, taken with a much older camera, of a section of the boy's tibia, the pitting, the discoloration. It was identical. It can't be. I looked back at Jane Doe's femur, then at the photograph of David Miller's tibia, the same subtle, corrosive damage. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. A thread I had, until this very moment, failed to see. For decades, these cases had been filed away, forgotten, dismissed as isolated tragedies. But they weren't isolated. They were pieces of a much larger, far more sinister puzzle, and I was the one holding the first two pieces, pieces that had been deliberately, meticulously placed. The weight of that realization settled on me, heavy and suffocating. I wasn't just looking at bones anymore. The chill in the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, wasn't just from the refrigeration unit humming in the corner. It seeped into my bones, a cold dread far more profound than any low temperature. I stood transfixed, one hand still hovering over Jane Doe's femur, the other clutching the photograph of David Miller's tibia. The evidence, stark and undeniable, laid itself out before me. The same insidious, almost imperceptible pitting, the peculiar crystalline residue nestled in the bone's microscopic valleys. It was a signature, etched not in ink, but in decay. My mind raced, grappling with the sheer audacity of the implication. Two cases, decades apart, hundreds of miles separating their discovery sites, yet linked by this precise, unique form of bone degradation. This wasn't a coincidence, not some freak environmental anomaly. This was deliberate. This was a pattern, and if it was a pattern, then there were more. There had to be more, I muttered, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I spun away from the examination table, my gaze sweeping over the meager setup. My laptop, an aging model, sat precariously on a rickety metal cart, its screen a welcome portal to a world beyond these four walls. I needed data. I needed history. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the clicks echoing in the silent room. The connection was sluggish, the cursor spinning in exasperating circles, a testament to the limited resources I was currently operating with. Every moment felt like an eternity. I started broad, searching for any unidentified remains exhibiting unusual taphonomic processes, atypical bone erosion, or unexplained skeletal degradation. The database, a behemoth of information, coughed up thousands of entries, too many I needed to refine. I pulled up the detailed reports for Jane Doe and David Miller, focusing on the specific descriptions of their bone damage. The forensic anthropologist who'd handled Miller's case had noted microscopic etching consistent with a low pH corrosive agent, yet atypical in its distribution. Jane Doe's initial report was less specific, attributing the damage to environmental factors, a catch-all phrase that now made my stomach clench. But my detailed analysis, performed just hours ago, confirmed the identical pattern. I crafted a more precise search query, incorporating keywords like atypical low pH etching, crystalline bone residue, and post-mortem skeletal pitting, unknown origin. I set the geographical parameters wide, a national sweep, and the time frame even wider, pushing back 50 years. The search bar word, then finally a list populated the screen. My breath hitched. It wasn't thousands this time. It was dozens. A manageable number, but still enough to send a shiver down my spine. Each entry was a person, a life, a tragedy. I clicked on the oldest case first, a partial skeleton discovered in a remote forest clearing in Oregon, 1978. The victim, dubbed Forest Man, remained unidentified. I scrolled to the skeletal analysis section. My eyes darted across the text, scanning for the telltale signs. Remarks: minor, diffuse surface pitting observed on long bones, attributed to prolonged exposure to acidic soil conditions. Acidic soil could be. I opened another, desert woman, found near Phoenix in 1985. Remarks: slight localized erosion on femoral shaft, possibly insect activity or mineral leaching. My heart began to sink. Was I just seeing what I wanted to see? There was this confirmation bias, a desperate attempt to connect disparate dots. The human mind was a master at finding patterns, even where none existed. I leaned back in my creaking chair, rubbing my temples. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was just coincidence, a trick of the light, a figment of my sleep-deprived imagination. Then I saw it. An entry from 1993, a case from the Appalachian Mountains. Ridge Runner, another unidentified male. The report was unusually detailed, written by a meticulous, if somewhat verbose, forensic pathologist. Under the heading, Unusual Taphonomic Observations, it read, specific, fine-grained pitting noted on distal tibia and proximal humerus. Damage pattern suggests highly localized, slow-acting corrosive agent. Microscopic examination revealed unusual crystalline deposits within etched areas, inconsistent with common environmental factors or animal scavenging. Further analysis inconclusive. My fingers trembled as I highlighted the passage. Inconsistent with common environmental factors. Unusual crystalline deposits. Highly localized, slow-acting corrosive agent. This wasn't just acidic soil or mineral leaching. This was precise. This was it. I opened the attached high-resolution photographs. Their magnified tenfold was the unmistakable signature. The same subtle, almost elegant, corrosive damage. The same telltale crystalline residue gleaming faintly under the digital microscope. It was identical to what I'd found on Jane Doe and David Miller. Not similar, identical. The doubt evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and a fresh wave of horror. This wasn't confirmation bias. This was a trail. I clicked through the other entries on my refined search list. River Girl, 1998, Minnesota, same damage. Swamp Man, 2005, Louisiana, same damage. Badlands Bones, 2012, North Dakota. Same damage. Each click was a punch to the gut. Each discovery, a reaffirmation of a terrifying truth. The dates, the locations, the demographics, they varied wildly, but the method, the precise, almost artistic degradation of the bones was a constant. This was a single, monstrous narrative, written in bone and decay, spanning the breadth of the country, stretching across generations. Until now. I sat there, surrounded by the humming quiet of the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the grim reality. And I was standing right at the edge. The fluorescence of the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, hummed a low, grating tune, a sound I'd come to associate with the quiet desperation of forgotten evidence. Dust motes danced in the weak beams of my headlamp, swirling around the stainless steel gurney. The air, thick with the metallic tang of formaldehyde and something else. Something faintly floral and unsettling pressed in on me. The file lay open on a chipped laminate counter, its pages dog-eared and stained. Case 78B, the victim, a young woman found miles from anywhere, her remains weathered by time and elements. The initial report was a dead end, a laundry list of unknowns. But the supplemental notes, the ones tucked away in the back, those were the ones that had snagged my attention. Unusual crystalline deposits. Highly localized, slow-acting corrosive agent. I traced the faded ink with a gloved fingertip. It echoed the findings from Case 94C, the hiker discovered in the foothills, and Case 03A, the skeletal remains unearthed near the old quarry. 3 victims, separated by years, found in vastly different locations, yet the forensic reports whispered the same unsettling language. This wasn't nature's work. This was intentional. My gaze drifted to the specimen jar on the counter. Inside, preserved in cloudy liquid, were fragments of bone, shards so small they were barely discernible. These were from 78B. The lab technicians, working with the limited equipment available at this rural clinic, had managed to scrape off enough of the crystalline residue for preliminary analysis. It was a painstaking process, and I owed them a debt of gratitude. They'd done their best with what they had. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. The crystals shimmered, catching the light like microscopic diamonds, but they weren't beautiful. They were alien, and they were the key. My mind raced, piecing together the fragmented reports, the timelines, the geographic spreads. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. It was too much of a coincidence. Anything, user Ib, the voice of the local investigator, a man whose worn tweed jacket seemed as much a part of him as his skin. Startled me, he stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. I shook my head, not looking up. Still sifting, this residue, it's unlike anything I've documented before. I paused, then added, it suggests a deliberate application, not some random environmental factor. He grunted, a sound of weary understanding. We've had our share of strange ones out here, but nothing like this, not for this long. This long, I repeated, the words tasting like ash. This wasn't just a recent spree. The dates in the files stretched back decades. Whoever was doing this, they were patient, they were methodical. My thoughts drifted unbidden to a case from years ago. Before the major labs, before the sophisticated equipment, there was a young woman, Sarah. I'd been a junior analyst then, eager, brimming with a confidence that now felt like naive arrogance. Her case had been similar, a body found in a remote area. Few clues, a swift dismissal as an accident or exposure. But there had been something, a faint discoloration on the bone, a subtle degradation that the prevailing wisdom couldn't explain. I'd pushed, I'd argued, I'd presented my findings, but I'd been dismissed. Too inexperienced, too imaginative. The memory stung, a phantom ache in my chest. I'd failed her. I hadn't been sharp enough, or perhaps just not loud enough, to make them listen. That failure had gnawed at me. A constant reminder of the stakes, of the lives that could be saved if only the truth was unearthed. This wasn't just about solving cases anymore. This was about rectifying past oversights, about giving voice to those who could no longer speak. The composition of these crystals, I murmured, more to myself than to the investigator, it's highly stable, almost inert until exposed to specific biological compounds. Then, it degrades organic material. Slowly. Efficiently, I tapped the file, and the pattern of application, it's not random, it's almost surgical. The investigator stepped further into the room, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. Surgical, you mean like they knew exactly where to? He trailed off, his eyes widening slightly. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the jar. Exactly, and the way it breaks down the bone, it leaves minimal trace. It would make identification incredibly difficult, especially after years in the elements. I finally looked up at him, my expression grim. Whoever this is, they've been doing this for a very long time. The hum of the lights seemed to intensify, a counterpoint to the frantic beat of my own heart. This was a meticulously crafted, decades-long campaign of destruction, and I was finally seeing the threads that bound them together. The anger I'd felt about Sarah's case, about all the others like hers, coalesced into a sharp, clear focus. Not again. The air in the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet that always clung to death. It was a smell I knew too well, a smell that had become the unwelcome perfume of my life. The single overhead fluorescent light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. Each flicker seemed to emphasize the stillness of the bodies laid out on the stainless steel tables. This wasn't just a collection of forgotten victims. It was a gallery of unanswered questions, and I was running out of wall space. I moved from the table holding the latest find, the young woman whose remains had been discovered near the old logging road, to the one prepped for the man from the late 80s, his bones unearthed by a farmer's plow. My gloved fingers traced the delicate curve of a femur, then the rough texture of a fractured rib. I'd been at this for weeks, cross-referencing dental records, piecing together skeletal histories, and chasing down leads that had gone cold before I was even out of university. Each case on its own was a tragedy, a life cut short, a family left in limbo, but together they were a monstrous symphony. The pathologist, a quiet man who spoke more with his hands than his voice, was meticulously cleaning a bone fragment. He'd been cooperative, if a little unnerved by my insistence on re-examining evidence that had been logged and filed years ago. "Anything new, User Ib?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the quiet. I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the skull I held. It was the woman's. The trauma was evident, a clean, sharp fracture, but it was the way it had happened, the angle, the force. It felt familiar. I'd seen it before, though I couldn't quite place it. My mind was a cluttered archive, and sometimes the files refused to open. I'd spent the last night poring over the reports from the earlier cases, the ones from decades ago. The first victim, a hiker missing for years, her remains found in a shallow grave in the state park. Then the fisherman, his boat found adrift, his body never recovered until a storm washed ashore what was left of him. And the others, scattered across the years, each seemingly unconnected. Different locations, different ages, different causes of death, or what we thought were causes of death. Something subtle, something the initial investigators had missed, or perhaps dismissed as coincidence. I picked up a high-powered magnifying glass and leaned closer to the skull. The fracture wasn't just a break. There were micro-fractures radiating from the impact point, almost like a spiderweb. And then I saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible pitting, a series of minute holes along the edge of the fracture. It was so small, so easily overlooked. My breath hitched. I'd seen that pitting before, not on a skull but on a piece of bone from the fisherman. I remembered it vividly. The initial report had attributed the damage to decomposition and the elements, but looking at it now under this harsh light with the woman's skull as a comparison, it wasn't decomposition. It was something else, something deliberate. My heart began to pick up its pace, not with fear, but with a growing, insistent urgency. I moved quickly to the other table, the one holding the fisherman's remains. The pathologist watched me, his brow furrowed. I ignored him, my focus entirely on the collection of bones laid out before me. I found the section of the cranium that had been recovered, the area showing significant damage. I brought the magnifying glass to my eye, my hand trembling slightly. There it was. The same minute pitting. The same pattern of micro-fractures. It was identical. This wasn't random. This was a signature. The killer, whoever they were, was leaving their mark, a calling card etched into the very bones of their victims. And it wasn't just a weapon, it was something specific, something that caused this particular type of damage. I looked back at the woman's skull, then at the fisherman's. Two victims, decades apart, found hundreds of miles from each other, yet their bones bore the same peculiar wound. The implication was staggering. This killer wasn't just active, they were patient, they were meticulous, they were capable of operating for an extended period, leaving behind a trail of devastation that had gone unrecognized until now. The pathologist cleared his throat. "User Ib, are you all right?" I finally looked up, my eyes meeting his. The flickering light seemed to catch the intensity in my gaze. And he's been doing this for a very long time. The weight of that realization pressed down on me, heavier than any specimen I'd ever handled. The air in the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, hung thick and still, a stark contrast to the frantic energy buzzing beneath my skin. The flickering fluorescent light above the examination table cast long, dancing shadows, making the stark white tiles seem to recede into an unsettling abyss. I traced the faint scar tissue on the tibia I held, a ghost of a healed fracture, and then the delicate curve of the fibula. This wasn't just about the missing woman from 98. It wasn't just about the hiker from 82. My colleague, the one with the perpetually tired eyes and the surprisingly steady hands, was meticulously cataloging the few remaining artifacts from the previous case. He hummed a low, tuneless melody that did little to soothe the knot tightening in my gut. "Anything?" he asked, not looking up. I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the bone in my hands. The fracture pattern is consistent, not identical. The force applied, the angle, it's the same signature. I set the tibia down with a soft thud, but that's not what's bothering me. He finally met my eyes, a flicker of concern crossing his usually impassive features. "What is it, user Ib?" "It's the age of the remains," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "This hiker, the one from 82, the radiocarbon dating was a bit fuzzy, but we were looking at mid-20s to early 30s. The 98 victim, definitely late teens, early 20s, and this one," I gestured to the small, bagged fragments on the adjacent tray, too fragmented to be certain. The bone density suggested a younger individual, perhaps even a child. If my preliminary assessment is correct, we're looking at a victim who was a child. My colleague stopped his work, the tweezers clattering against the metal tray. He peered at the skeletal fragments, then back at the tibia. "A child. I rest sure. I'm not sure yet," I admitted, the words feeling like laid. "But the indicators are there. And if that's true, then the timeline, it stretches back decades. Decades, and the method of disposal, the way these remains are found, or rather, not found. It's all too similar." I remembered the old case files I'd pored over in the precinct's dusty archives, the ones that had been dismissed as isolated incidents, unfortunate accidents, or simply unsolved disappearances. The fragmented reports, the blurry photographs, the scribbled notes of detectives long retired. Now they were starting to coalesce, forming a horrifying picture. There was the vagrant found near the old logging road in 75. The anonymous tip about a child's backpack discovered near the abandoned quarry in 63. Each one a single, isolated tragedy. But what if they weren't isolated? What if they were pieces of a single, monstrous mosaic? The environmental conditions here are harsh, my colleague mused, his gaze sweeping over the sparse equipment in the room. Preservation isn't exactly ideal. He's been doing this for a very long time, using the remoteness, the decay, the sheer passage of time to his advantage. He's not just a killer, he's an artist of absence. I felt a tremor run through me, not of fear, but of a grim, dawning understanding. The scale of it was staggering. It wasn't just a few cases, it was a legacy of violence, meticulously hidden, spanning generations. How many more bones lay undiscovered, waiting for the earth to finally yield its secrets? The weight of it settled on me, a crushing burden. I looked at the tibia, then at the bagged fragments, the silent testament to lives brutally extinguished. I had to be wrong. This couldn't be real. But the evidence, however scant, pointed to a horrifying truth. The pattern, once I allowed myself to see it, was undeniable. The killer was not just elusive. He was a phantom, a whisper in the wind, a shadow that had been lurking in the periphery of unsolved mysteries for longer than I had been alive. And he was still out there. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, despite the stifling heat of the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources. My work had just become infinitely more complex and infinitely more dangerous. The air in the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, hung thick and damp, smelling of disinfectant, trying its best to mask something older, something deeper. It was a scent I'd grown accustomed to, a constant companion in these quiet, echoing spaces. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, but in here, the light was a sterile, unwavering white. I ran a gloved hand over the worn wooden table, the grain rough beneath my fingertips. The skeletal remains of the latest victim, a young woman whose file had been gathering dust for nearly 30 years, lay before me. Her story, like so many others, had been a whisper in the wind, a tragedy swallowed by time and indifference. But now, with the pattern emerging, each bone felt like a shouted accusation. My colleague, a quiet individual with eyes that had seen too much, was meticulously cataloging the evidence from the previous excavation. They worked with a focused intensity, their movements precise, almost ritualistic. I appreciated their diligence. It was easy to get lost in the sheer enormity of it all, to let the weight of decades of unanswered questions crush you, but we couldn't afford to. Anything on the soil samples? I asked, my voice a low rumble in the stillness. They paused, then shook their head. Still nothing conclusive. Standard loam. Consistent with the area. No trace elements that scream out of place. Frustrating. Every time I thought I was getting closer, a door would slam shut. The killer was a ghost, leaving behind only the faintest of echoes. I turned back to the skeleton, my gaze sweeping over the delicate curve of the rib cage, the long, elegant lines of the femur. There had to be something. Some overlooked detail, some anomaly the original investigators missed in their haste or their lack of understanding. I picked up a small, tarnished metal object from the tray of recovered artifacts. It was a button, ornate, with a faded crest I couldn't quite decipher. It had been found lodged deep in the soil, a few feet from where the body had been exhumed. The original report had dismissed it as an inconsequential piece of debris, likely from a passing hiker or farmer. But in light of the pattern, nothing was inconsequential. "This crest," I murmured, turning it under the harsh light. "It looks familiar, but I can't place it." My colleague leaned closer, their brow furrowed. "Military, or perhaps a fraternal order? Could be," I conceded, though a prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. It felt deliberate, too specific to be random. I carefully bagged the button, adding it to the growing pile of potential significance. Later that evening, back in my makeshift office, a cramped space carved out of an unused storage room adjacent to the morgue, I pored over the case files again. The sheer volume of paper was overwhelming. Decades of reports, witness statements that led nowhere, grainy photographs of crime scenes long since overgrown. I was looking for a connection, a thread that ran through them all, a signature that wasn't immediately obvious. I'd been tracing the geographical locations of the disappearances, plotting them on a large, faded map tacked to the wall. They were scattered seemingly random across the countryside. No discernible pattern, no obvious concentration of victims. It was as if the killer was a phantom, appearing and vanishing without a trace. Then my eyes fell on a detail in one of the older files, a brief mention of a local legend, something dismissed by the police as folklore. A tale of a shadow man who haunted the old logging trails, a figure said to lure people away with promises of forgotten treasures. It was the kind of story that sprung up in isolated communities, fueled by fear and isolation. I'd almost dismissed it myself, but the button, the crest, it nagged at me. I remembered seeing something similar years ago in a historical society archive. I couldn't recall the context, but the image was lodged somewhere in the back of my mind. I started sifting through the files again, this time with a different focus, not on the victims, but on the periphery, the people who had lived near the disappearance sites, the old-timers who might have remembered something, anything, that wasn't in the official reports. It was a long shot, a desperate grasp for a lead. I found it in the appendix of a file from the late 1970s. A brief, almost apologetic note from the original investigator about interviewing an elderly woman who lived near the site of the first disappearance. He had been reluctant to speak, claiming the old stories were best left undisturbed. But he had mentioned one detail, a fleeting observation, a peculiar vehicle, an old, dark-colored truck that she'd seen parked near the woods on several occasions around the time the young man vanished. She couldn't recall the make or model, only that it had a distinctive hand-painted symbol on the tailgate. She couldn't describe the symbol, only that it was like a twisted knot, but not quite. A twisted knot. My breath hitched. I pulled out the bagged button again, holding it up to the dim light. The crest was indeed intricate, with swirling lines and interlocking shapes. It wasn't a national symbol or a common emblem. It was specific, and it bore a striking resemblance to the description of the symbol on the truck. This wasn't just about bones and timelines anymore. The legend, the truck, the symbol, they were pieces of a puzzle finally beginning to fit. I looked back at the map, at the scattered points marking the victims' last known locations. Suddenly, they didn't seem so random. They were connected not by geography, but by something far more insidious. The killer was not a phantom. They were real, and I was getting closer. The tension in the small room was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. The button, it was the damn button. I turned it over and over in my gloved fingers, the faint metallic sheen catching the weak fluorescent light of the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources. The crest, intricate and unfamiliar, felt like a key I'd been searching for, tucked away in the pocket of a forgotten coat. The description I'd seen weeks ago. In a dusty file box about a missing hiker from '87, a peculiar detail noted by the responding officer about a unique button found near the scene. I'd dismissed it then, a stray bit of detritus. Now, it felt like a beacon. My mind raced, sifting through the scattered fragments of the cold cases. The missing hiker. The unidentified woman found near the old quarry in '92. The supposed boating accident victim, whose remains were so badly preserved they were almost unidentifiable in '05. Each case had been a dead end, a ghost story whispered in precinct hallways. But this damn button was a tangible link. I was kneeling on the cold linoleum floor of the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, surrounded by the sterile scent of disinfectant and something else, something vaguely earthy and unsettling. The refrigeration unit hummed a low, steady drone, a counterpoint to the frantic thumping in my chest. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through images. I'd meticulously cataloged a blurry photograph of a button found on the hiker's jacket, a faded sketch from the '92 victim's belongings. They weren't identical, not precisely, but the style, the spirit of the design, it was too close to be coincidence. This wasn't just about finding a pattern anymore. This was about a person, a meticulous, patient, and terrifyingly deliberate person. I leaned back against the cold metal of a stainless steel table, the polished surface reflecting my own strained face. The '87 hiker, a young man named David Miller, had vanished during a solo trek in the state park. No witnesses, no trace. The '92 Jane Doe, found miles away, her identity a complete mystery. And the '05 case, a man whose boat capsized. All seemingly isolated incidents, but the timeline was stretching decades apart. This wasn't a spree, this was a long game. My gaze drifted to the specimen drawer beside me. Inside lay the fragmented remains of the '05 victim. I'd spent days with them, trying to coax secrets from bone and sinew, but the water had taken its toll. Yet, even in their degraded state, there had been subtle anomalies. A precise, almost surgical incision on a rib fragment that had baffled the initial medical examiner. A peculiar pattern of wear on a molar, too uniform to be accidental. I'd filed them away as curiosities, but now they felt like breadcrumbs. I stood up, my knees protesting. I needed to cross-reference. I needed to see if there was anything else, anything at all, that tied these disparate threads together. I pulled out my laptop, its screen a stark white rectangle against the gloom. I opened the case files, the digital ghosts of victims long gone. As I typed, a sudden sharp rap on the heavy metal door made me jump. My head snapped up, my heart leaping into my throat. Who would be here at this hour? The night shift attendant at the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, was usually a quiet presence, keeping to himself. User Ib. A voice called, muffled by the thick metal. I hesitated. Yes, got a delivery for you, urgent, at this time of night. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, a prickle of unease crawling over my skin. I walked to the door, peering through the small, reinforced window. He held a plain, brown cardboard box. As I opened the door a crack, the courier thrust the box towards me. It was surprisingly heavy. "Sign here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. He held out a digital signature pad. I took the stylus, my hand trembling slightly. The man's eyes met mine for a fleeting second, and there was something in them. It was the look of someone who knew more than they let on. I scribbled my name, my usual neat signature, a shaky scrawl. The courier nodded, retrieved the pad, and turned to leave. "Wait," I said, my voice a little louder than I intended. "Who sent this?" He paused, his back to me. "No sender listed. Just a delivery order, standard procedure." He walked away, his footsteps receding down the sterile hallway. Standard procedure? My gut screamed otherwise. I closed the door, locking it securely. The box sat on the floor, an enigma. With a deep breath, I knelt and began to open it. Inside, nestled in packing peanuts, was not what I expected. No evidence, no new files, just a single, perfectly preserved apple. And beneath it, a small, folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I unfolded it. The message was short, written in neat block letters. "Enjoy my investigation, be careful what I dig up." My breath caught. This wasn't a delivery. This was a message, a warning. The killer knew. They knew I was looking, and they were watching. The apple, pristine and unblemished, felt like a mockery, a symbol of something that had been tampered with, something rotten beneath a perfect exterior. It was all starting to converge, and the convergence was staring right back at me. The game had just become infinitely more dangerous. The apple sat on the steel examination table, stark against the sterile white. Not a bruise, not a blemish, just an apple. My mind reeled. Why this? Why now? The anonymous delivery, left outside my temporary workspace at the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, felt less like a threat and more like a taunt. A game. I circled the table, my worn boots squeaking softly on the linoleum. The air in the small room was thick with the faint, lingering scent of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and cold that always clung to places like this. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the unease settling in my gut. The delivery hadn't been signed. No note, just the single, perfect piece of fruit. I'd spent the last hour turning it over and over in my mind, trying to decipher its meaning. Was it a symbol, a coded message, or just a random act of psychological warfare? My fingers traced the cool, smooth skin of the apple. The killer knew I was close. They knew I was piecing things together. The pattern I'd uncovered across 3 decades, across a dozen victims, the subtle signature, the almost imperceptible thread connecting them all. It had to have tipped them off. I glanced at the file open on a nearby counter. Victim number 7, a young woman found near a forgotten orchard. Victim number 3, a farmer whose property bordered an old apple grove. Victim number 1, a child whose favorite snack, according to the initial reports, had been an apple. It was too much to be coincidence. The apple was the key, but what did it unlock? A sudden thought, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the fog of my confusion. What if the apple wasn't just a symbol of the past, but a prophecy of the future? What if it was a clue to their next move? I pulled my gaze away from the fruit and looked around the sparse room. The examination table, the stainless steel trays, the collection of tools laid out with methodical precision. This was my current base of operations, a far cry from my usual lab, but functional, and the killer knew that too. They knew where to find me. My heart gave a little jump, a physical reaction I tried to suppress. Fear was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not now. I needed to think, to connect the dots. I walked over to the wall where a large map of the region was pinned. My finger traced the locations of the known victims, marked with red pins. The rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, was right in the center of this grim constellation. The apple, the orchard, the groves. I remembered a detail from the initial report on victim number 7. She'd been found in a secluded area, a place locals called the Old Orchard, known for its heirloom apple trees that still bore fruit, even after decades of neglect. It was a place people went to escape, to be alone. A place like this rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, was also a place of isolation. A place where one might go to be alone. A chilling realization dawned. The killer wasn't just leaving a message, they were leaving a breadcrumb. They wanted me to follow. They wanted me to play their game. My hands clenched into fists. This was it. The climax, the moment I'd been building towards. I had to use this knowledge, this bizarre offering, to my advantage. I picked up the apple again, its weight solid and real in my palm. If the killer was playing with symbols, then I would play their game. If they wanted to draw me out, I would let them. I needed to make myself the bait. I walked back to the examination table and carefully placed the apple in the center. Then I opened a fresh file, the clean white pages a stark contrast to the grim reality of my work. I began to write, my pen scratching across the paper, not with forensic observations, but with a deliberate narrative. I wrote about the apple, about the potential symbolism, about my growing certainty of a connection to the orchards and groves. I wrote as if I were detailing my latest breakthrough, my voice carefully calibrated to sound excited, eager, perhaps even a little reckless. I knew the delivery man, the one who'd brought the apple, was a regular, a local probably, someone who saw and heard things, someone who could perhaps be persuaded to misplace a certain document. The wind outside seemed to pick up, rustling the dry leaves of the few trees that managed to survive this far out. It was a lonely place, a perfect place for someone to disappear or for someone to be found. I paused, my pen hovering over the page, a flicker of doubt. Was I overthinking this? There was I projecting my own desires onto a simple, random act. The killer had been operating for decades, elusive and unseen. They wouldn't be so easily lured. But the apple, it felt too deliberate, too personal, and the performance was for me. I continued writing, my resolve hardening. I would leave this file, this carefully constructed narrative, where it could be found. I would make sure the right ears heard about my breakthrough. And then I would wait. I would wait by the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, and I would wait for the killer to come to me. The game was on. The air in the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, hung thick and still, heavy with the scent of disinfectant and something else. Something metallic and ancient. I'd been sitting in my borrowed chair for what felt like an eternity, the single bare bulb overhead casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. Each creak of the building, each rustle of the wind outside, sent a jolt through me. This was it. The bait was set. My gaze drifted to the slab, to the latest anonymous offering from the earth. The chill wasn't just from the refrigeration unit. It seeped from the very bones I'd spent weeks piecing together. The meticulous work, the painstaking comparison of skeletal fragments across decades had finally yielded the ghost I'd been hunting. Not a ghost, though, a very real, very dangerous man. He'd been careful, so careful, leaving just enough of a signature to draw me in, but never enough to catch him. Until now. I traced the faint scar on my own hand, a reminder of a past encounter, a near miss that still pricked at me. This time I wouldn't miss. The local constable, bless his well-meaning but overwhelmed heart, had been hesitant to go along with my plan. But the evidence, the sheer impossibility of these scattered remains pointing to one perpetrator, had finally convinced him. He was out there, somewhere, keeping watch, ready to move in when I gave the signal. A faint scraping sound, barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator, snagged my attention. My head snapped up. The heavy metal door to the storage room, the one I'd deliberately left ajar, was slowly swinging inward. My breath hitched. No turning back. A figure emerged from the gloom, silhouetted against the dim light filtering from the main room. He moved with an unnerving fluidity like water flowing over stone. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound as he crossed the threshold. His eyes, I could feel them on me, even before I could properly see them. "You came," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I pushed myself up from the chair, keeping my hands visible, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't want to spook him, not yet. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over the room, over the slabs, lingering for a moment on the one I'd been examining. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement. "Your user IB," he stated, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. It was a voice I'd never heard, yet it felt eerily familiar, as if I'd been anticipating its sound for years. "And you're the one who's been so busy," I replied, my eyes locked on his. I could see the glint of intelligence in them, the sharp, assessing look of someone who understood the game. This wasn't some brute, this was someone who thought, who planned. He took another step closer, and I could finally make out his features, but his eyes were unnervingly bright, a startling blue that seemed to bore right through me. "Busy is a matter of perspective," he said, his gaze flicking to the ceiling, then back to me. "Some might say I've been collecting. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. I knew what he was collecting lives. "You've left a trail, you know," I said, pushing my luck. I needed him to talk, to reveal something, anything that would give me an edge. "Faint, but it's there. A pattern. The way you choose them, the way you prepare them." He tilted his head, a gesture that was both curious and predatory. "And you think you've figured it out? After all this time, you think you've finally pieced together my methods?" "I know enough," I said, my own resolve hardening. The tension in the room was a palpable thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. "I know you're meticulous, I know you're patient, and I know you have a very specific appreciation for the human form." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Appreciation is a kind word. Let's just say I have a deep understanding of its fragility and its resilience." He gestured vaguely towards the slab. "You've done well, user IB. You've managed to find my little collection, but finding them is one thing, understanding them—" I could feel a bead of sweat trickling down my temple. He was toying with me, I knew it. But I also knew he was curious. He wanted to see how much I'd figured out. "I understand that you've been doing this for a very long time," I said, my voice low and even. "Longer than anyone suspected. You've hidden in plain sight, moving from place to place, leaving only echoes behind." He took another step, closing the distance between us. Now he was only a few feet away. I could smell a faint, earthy scent on him, like damp soil. "Echoes are all that remain, aren't they?" he murmured, his eyes fixed on mine. "And I am very good at listening to those echoes." He paused, his gaze dropping to my hands, then slowly rising back to my face. "But what happens when the echo stops? When the source is right in front of you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind raced, searching for the right words, the right move. The constable was out there, waiting for my signal, but I couldn't give it yet. Not until I knew for sure. Not until I had him cornered. He smiled again, a slow, unsettling stretch of his lips. "You're waiting, aren't you, for your friend to burst through the door, but he won't. Not yet. Because I'm the one in control here, user Ib, and I've been waiting for this moment for a very, very long time." He reached into his jacket pocket, and my muscles tensed, ready to spring. The moment of truth. My breath hitched. A silent prayer caught in my throat. The stranger's hand emerged from his worn tweed jacket, not with a weapon, but with a small, tarnished silver locket. He held it out, his gaze steady, almost pleading. It wasn't the confrontation I'd braced for, but it felt no less charged. "This," he said, his voice a low rasp, "is for her. I understand." I didn't understand, not yet. My training screamed caution, but a deeper instinct, honed by years of piecing together shattered lives, urged me to look. The locket was old, its surface scratched, but a faint etching of a single rose was still visible. I hesitated, my eyes flicking to the dimly lit interior of the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources. The air, already heavy with the sterile scent of disinfectant and something else, something indefinably sad, seemed to thicken. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he opened the locket. Inside, two faded photographs stared back. A young woman, smile radiant, her eyes full of a life cut tragically short. Beside her, a younger version of the man standing before me, his face unlined, his hope palpable. "He was my daughter," he finally said, his voice cracking. "They took her, just like they took the others." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The others. The cold cases, the missing pieces. It was all starting to coalesce, a horrifying mosaic forming in my mind. The scattered victims, spanning decades, their lives extinguished in ways that had always seemed disparate. The young woman in the locket, her story echoing the quiet despair of the others I'd studied. My focus sharpened. The stranger wasn't a killer, not in the way I'd initially feared. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "I've been looking, for a very long time, trying to find them. Not in the way I think. It's a network, a system, a network. That explained the disparate methods, the geographical spread, the sheer audacity of it all. It wasn't a lone wolf, it was a pack." He gestured vaguely towards the back of the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources. "I've seen things, heard things, they're careful but they leave traces, small things, like the way the light catches a certain piece of metal, or the subtle scent of a particular oil, or the way a body is positioned almost reverently." My gaze snapped to the examination table. The latest victim. I'd noted the almost meticulous placement of her limbs, the absence of struggle beyond what was necessary. At the time, I'd attributed it to the killer's efficiency, their lack of rage. But now, reverently, I murmured, the word tasting strange on my tongue. I remembered the faint, almost imperceptible dusting of a fine, metallic powder on the victim's skin, something I'd dismissed as environmental contamination. Not just life, something more, a piece of their essence. My blood, which had been running hot with adrenaline, now felt like ice water. This was beyond anything I had ever encountered. This wasn't just murder, it was desecration. He looked down at the locket again, his fingers tracing the faded rose. "They took my daughter's locket. They took her smile. They took her light." A profound sadness washed over me, mingling with the gnawing urgency of the investigation. This man, this stranger, had been living with this grief, this obsession, for years. He was a victim himself, twisted by loss into something else. Suddenly, a distant siren wailed, growing louder. The stranger's head snapped up, his eyes widening with a primal fear. "They know I'm here," he breathed. "They know I spoke to I." My heart leaped into my throat. Had I made a mistake? Had I led them right to him? Or worse, had I put myself in their crosshairs? The tension in the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, ratcheted up to an unbearable pitch. He met my gaze, his eyes burning with a fierce resolve. "I have to understand," he replied, his voice urgent. "I have to find them, before they take anyone else." He turned and with a speed that belied his age, disappeared into the dimly lit corridor, leaving me alone with the locket, the photographs, and the terrifying, sudden realization that the true horror had only just begun. The investigation had just become deeply, horrifyingly personal. The silence that swallowed the retreating footsteps of the old man was a physical weight, pressing down on the bare concrete floor of the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources. The air, already thick with the antiseptic tang, and the metallic undercurrent I'd come to associate with these quiet, desolate places, now felt charged, brittle. I stood, my hand still outstretched from where the locket had been pressed into my palm, my gaze fixed on the empty space where he had been. "Wait," I whispered, the sound absorbed by the low hum of the refrigeration units. My voice felt foreign, scratchy. He was gone, just like that, a ghost in a place full of echoes. My fingers tightened around the cool, smooth metal of the locket. It was an old piece, tarnished silver, intricately engraved with a faded floral pattern. My thumb traced the worn edges. This wasn't just another piece of evidence. It was his message, his final cruel flourish. My breath hitched. I flipped open the locket. Inside, nestled behind a cloudy pane of plastic, were 2 miniature photographs. The images were faded, sepia-toned, the kind that might have been taken decades ago. One was of a young boy, no older than 7 or 8, with a gap-toothed smile and bright, mischievous eyes. The other was of a young woman. Her hair was pulled back, a simple ribbon woven through it. And he had a gentle, almost melancholic smile. My vision blurred. I lifted the locket closer, the cheap fluorescent lights above buzzing, casting a sickly pallor over the scene. The boy, there was something about the boy's eyes. A flicker of recognition, like a half-remembered dream. I knew those eyes. I knew them. My mind raced, sifting through countless faces, countless files, countless personal memories. Then it hit me. The boy's smile. The way his left eye crinkled when he laughed. It was a mirror image of a photograph I'd seen 1,000 times, tucked away in my own family album. A memory of a childhood friend who had vanished without a trace when we were both just starting school. Mark Davies. My hand trembled, the locket rattling faintly. Vanished from the local fair. Never a body found, never a laid. Just a gaping hole in a small community. My parents had told me he'd moved away, that his family had packed up. A convenient lie to shield a child from the ugly truth. But Mark was gone. The pattern, the disappearances, the specific age range of the victims. It suddenly clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. The young woman in the other photograph, I stared at her. Her features were softer, less defined by the faded print, but there was a familiarity there too, a subtle curve of the jaw, a particular set to her lips. It took a moment longer, a terrifying effort to push past the shock. And then the memory surfaced, sharp and cruel. My own mother in her late teens before she met my father, a photo she'd shown me once from her first job at the local diner, a brief, bittersweet memory of a simpler time. My mother and Mark Davies. The old man, the one who had just vanished, had known them. He hadn't just known them, he had targeted them. Or more likely, he was the one who had taken Mark. And the young woman, if that was my mother, what did it mean? Was she a victim? No, he was alive, he was my mother, knew me. A wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled back, my legs suddenly weak, hitting the stainless steel table with a dull thud. The instruments laid out for the preliminary examination clattered softly. The old man hadn't just appeared. He had been watching, waiting. I closed my eyes, trying to clear the fog of disbelief. No, this isn't right. I thought, a desperate voice in my head. Asterisk, you're making connections where there are none. It's a coincidence. The way he had looked at me, a flicker of something knowing, something triumphant in his rheumy eyes. I opened my eyes, the rural clinic morgue, making do with limited resources, feeling less like a sterile environment and more like a mausoleum of personal horror. I had always prided myself on my objectivity, my ability to detach and analyze. Now, that detachment was shattered. Every victim, every bone fragment, every piece of evidence I had painstakingly examined suddenly carried the weight of my own history. The old man wasn't just a witness or an informant. He was the architect of this decades-long nightmare. And he had come here, to this desolate place, not to confess, but to reveal himself, to taunt me with the truth, to show me how deeply intertwined our paths had always been. He knew my vulnerabilities, knew the ghosts of my past. My hand went to my pocket, fumbling for my phone. I needed to call the detective, relay this seismic shift in the investigation. But what would I say? The killer just left me a locket with pictures of my childhood friend and my mother and then vanished into thin air. It sounded insane, the ramblings of a sleep-deprived academic pushed past her breaking point. And yet, it was the horrifying truth. He had been playing with me, with all of us, leading me through the labyrinth of his past atrocities, only to spring this ultimate trap. He wanted me to know. I looked down at the locket again, the faded faces of Mark and my young mother staring back. The boy I'd played with, the woman who raised me. The chase wasn't over. It had just begun in earnest, with a clarity that burned like acid. The monster had shown his face, albeit briefly, and left his calling card. And now I would hunt him. The impact of this case would never leave me. It was etched into my very being, a permanent scar, but also a burning resolve. The game was no longer theoretical. It was personal, and I was ready to play.